Hey everyone, thanks for tuning in. Before we get started with today's story, I'd love to hear where you're watching from. Drop a comment below and let me know which city or country you're representing. It's always amazing to see how far these stories travel. Now, let's begin. The silence in Julian Vance's penthouse was a commodity he'd purchased at great expense. It was a thick, pristine quiet, broken only by the whisper of the climate control system and the distant, muted hum of the city 38 floors below. His world was one of polished black marble, of chrome that gleamed without a fingerprint, and of vast panes of glass that framed the sprawling metropolis as a conquered territory. Every object in the cavernous space was an island, perfectly placed and isolated, a reflection of the man who owned it. Julian stood before the window, his suit a slash of dark, expensive wool against the glittering twilight. He was the sole architect of this empire of glass and steel, a titan of finance whose name was a synonym for ruthless success. Yet the victory felt hollow, the silence not peaceful, but empty. It was the same corrosive emptiness that had settled in his chest 8 years ago, and had been his constant companion ever since. It was the ghost of a different silence, the one that had followed the hushed closing of a hospital room door, the one that had stolen his wife, Annalise, and left him with nothing but assets. He had channeled that grief, that all-consuming rage, into work. He had built JV Capital into an untouchable fortress, a monument to his inability to save the one person who mattered. Now he was at the apex, a black millionaire celebrated on magazine covers, a king in a sterile castle, and he had never felt more alone. The city lights blinked on, one by one, a galaxy of souls he could see but never touch. He adjusted the knot of his silk tie, his reflection a sharp, unsmiling stranger in the glass. It was time to prepare for the evening's charity gala, another performance of power and detached benevolence. A chime, delicate and unexpected, echoed through the foyer. It was the private doorbell, the one reserved for couriers of the highest importance or for the very few individuals who had direct access. His housekeeper, Mrs. Gable, had left for the day. Frowning, Julian moved from the window, his polished leather shoes making no sound on the deep pile rug. He expected a legal document, a last-minute portfolio demanding his signature. He did not expect to open the heavy, soundproof door and find the past staring up at him. On his doorstep stood a little girl, no older than 6 or 7, dwarfed by the immense doorway. She was drenched, her small pink coat soaked through from a sudden downpour he hadn't even noticed begin. Her hair, a cascade of tight, dark curls, was plastered to her forehead, and her large, impossibly familiar eyes were wide with a sorrow that seemed too vast for her small frame. It was the eyes that made Julian's breath catch in his throat, that made the blood drain from his face. They were Ilara's eyes. Ilara, the woman who had come after Annalise, a brief fiery comet of warmth and laughter in his desolate sky. A woman he had, in his grief-stricken cruelty, pushed away. The little girl shivered, clutching a crumpled, damp envelope in one tiny hand. She looked up at him, her gaze unwavering, and for a moment the entire city, the entire world, seemed to fall away. There was only this child, a miniature echo of a woman he hadn't allowed himself to think about in 7 years. "Are you Julian Vance?" she asked, her voice small but clear, not trembling as much as he would have expected. He could only nod, his own voice lost somewhere between his heart and his throat. The resemblance was terrifying, a perfect, impossible replication of Ilara's features on this child's face. The little girl took a shallow breath, her small shoulders squaring with a resolve that broke his heart. She extended the damp envelope. "My name is Serafina," she said. her voice finally cracking on the last word. "Mom just died. She said I should come find you." The word struck him with the force of a physical blow. Mom just died. Ilara. Dead. The carefully constructed walls of his world, the sterile silence, the detached ambition. It all fractured. The marble beneath his feet seemed to sway. He reached out, his hand trembling, to steady himself against the doorframe. He looked from the letter to the child, this tiny, sorrowful messenger, and saw not just the ghost of a woman he had lost, but the living, breathing consequence of a life he had refused to acknowledge. The color drained from his face, leaving him a pale, hollowed-out version of the powerful man he was supposed to be. In that moment, standing in the doorway of his empty kingdom, Julian Vance understood that his meticulously controlled world had just been irrevocably, terrifyingly set on fire. Julian's mind, usually a seamless engine of logic and calculation, had seized. He stood frozen, the little girl, Serafina, watching him with those hauntingly familiar eyes. He couldn't process the two facts that collided in his brain. Ilara is dead. This is her child. He finally managed to move, his actions stiff and automatic. He took the damp envelope from her small, cold hand. His fingers brushed against hers, and the contact was like a jolt of electricity, a connection to a life he'd thought was buried in the past. "Come in," he managed to say, his voice raspy. He stepped back, holding the door open. Serafina hesitated for only a second before stepping over the threshold into the immense, intimidating foyer. She looked like a lost sparrow in a cathedral, her worn sneakers silent on the polished stone. She dripped rainwater onto the floor, and it was the most real, most human thing to have happened in this space in years. "Wait here," Julian instructed, his tone softer than he intended. He gestured toward a severe-looking bench that was more art than furniture. Serafina walked over and sat on the very edge, her feet not reaching the floor, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. She didn't look around at the soaring ceilings or the expensive art. She just stared at her own reflection in the marble floor, a small, solitary figure in a world of giants. Julian retreated into his study, a sanctuary of dark wood and leather, and shut the door. His heart was hammering against his ribs. He needed a moment to breathe, to think. He looked down at the envelope. His name was written on the front in Ilara's elegant, looping script. A tremor ran through his hand as he tore it open. Inside was a single folded sheet of paper, the ink slightly blurred from the rain. "Julian," it began, "if you are reading this, then the worst has happened, and I am gone. And if that is true, then our daughter, Serafina, is with you. I can only imagine your shock. I know I have no right to ask anything of you, not after all this time, and certainly not after how we left things, but she has no one else. Forgive me, Julian. Forgive me for my silence, but most of all, forgive me for my fear. I found out I was pregnant a month after I left. I wanted to tell you, I swear I did. I flew back, stood across the street from your office building, ready to walk in and change our lives. But then I saw you. You were coming out of the lobby, surrounded by your associates. You look so formidable, so driven. But your eyes, Julian, your eyes were just as haunted as the day I walked away. You were still drowning in your grief for Annalise, and you were using your ambition as a shield. I realized in that moment that bringing a child into that storm would be a cruelty. I feared you would see her as a burden, another distraction from the empire you were building on the ruins of your heart. Or worse, I feared you would try to love her and fail, and the neglect would break her spirit. So I left. I chose to raise her on my own, in peace, surrounded by love, even if it meant we had very little else. Her name is Serafina. She is 7 years old. She loves the color yellow, hates thunderstorms, and can tell you every single fact about dolphins. She has your determination, Julian, And she has my eyes. She is the best part of both of us. All I have ever wanted was for her to be safe and loved. Now I have to trust the man I once loved to provide that for her. Don't let your ghosts consume her too. Please, Julian, just love her. That's all I ask. Ilara. Julian sank into his leather chair, the letter shaking in his grasp. Every word was a blade twisting in his gut. The guilt was suffocating. He had driven her away. His grief, his coldness, his relentless ambition, he had created the very circumstances that had robbed him of 7 years with his own daughter. He hadn't just lost Ilara. He had pushed her away and had been oblivious to the precious secret she carried. He remembered their last argument, the brutal words he'd thrown at her in his pain, accusing her of trying to replace Annalise, of not understanding his loss. He saw now that she had understood perfectly. She had seen the abyss within him and had done the only thing she could to protect her unborn child from it. He sat there for a long time, the silence of the study pressing in on him. He had to know for sure. His mind, grasping for procedure in the middle of chaos, took over. He picked up his phone, his thumb hovering over the number for his private investigator. It felt like a betrayal of Ilara's memory of the terrified child sitting in his foyer. But he was a man who dealt in facts, in verified truths. He needed certainty before his world tilted completely off its axis. He made the call, his voice low and strained, requesting a discreet background check on Ilara and a rush on a hospital inquiry. Then he stood up, tucked the letter into his inside pocket, and walked back out to the foyer. Serafina hadn't moved. She looked up as he approached, her expression unreadable. He saw it then, clear as day. The stubborn set of her jaw. It was his. That small detail was more convincing than any document. "Are you hungry?" he asked, the domestic question feeling foreign on his tongue. She gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. He led her into the kitchen, a vast, stainless steel landscape that was used more by caterers than by him. He opened the refrigerator, a monument to emptiness, containing little more than bottled water, a bottle of champagne, and some gourmet olives. It was the refrigerator of a man who didn't live in his own home. A profound sense of shame washed over him. He couldn't even offer a grieving child a glass of milk. He turned to her, feeling utterly, hopelessly inadequate. "We'll have to order something," he said. "You can have whatever you want." Serafina just looked at him, her silence a judgment on the glittering, empty world he had built. He was a king with no food to offer a child. It was in that moment, staring at the barren shelves of his own life, that Julian began to understand the true depth of his poverty. The results from his private investigator, a man named Harris, came back within hours, confirming the unthinkable. Ilara Dubois had passed away 2 days prior from a sudden brain aneurysm. She had been living in a small 2-bedroom apartment in a working-class neighborhood on the other side of the city. She worked as a freelance graphic designer and, by all accounts, had lived a quiet, modest life, devoted entirely to her daughter. The final piece of the puzzle clicked into place, cold and hard and undeniable. There was no doubt. Julian hung up the phone, the world swimming before his eyes. It was all true. While he had been closing multi-million-dollar deals and attending soulless galas, his daughter had been learning to read, celebrating birthdays, and living a life completely separate from his, a life he had been unworthy of being a part of. The next step was a formality, a concession to the man he used to be. He needed definitive biological proof. He knew a private lab that could be discreet and fast. Arranging it felt clinical and cold, a stark contrast to the small, warm presence in his guest room. He found Serafina asleep, curled into a tight ball in the center of the enormous king-sized bed, looking even smaller amidst the expanse of high thread count sheets. He had given her a spare T-shirt of his to sleep in, and it swallowed her whole, the sleeves hanging far past her hands. He had ordered pizza, a food he hadn't eaten in a decade, and she had picked at one slice before her exhaustion and grief had overtaken her. He had shown her to the room, and she had simply climbed into the bed and turned her face to the wall without a word. Now, watching her sleep, Julian felt a wave of emotion so powerful it nearly brought him to his knees. It was a complex cocktail of guilt, awe, and a terrifying, nascent sense of love. He saw the faint flutter of her eyelids and wondered what she was dreaming. Was she with her mother? Was she scared? He reached out, his hand hovering over her back, wanting to offer comfort but feeling like an intruder. His touch, he feared, was a thing of sharp edges and cold transactions. What could he possibly offer this child? The next day, the DNA test was conducted with quiet efficiency by a private nurse who came to the penthouse. Serafina was brave, barely flinching at the swab, her gaze fixed on Julian as if trying to decipher him. He felt like a fraud, subjecting her to this clinical procedure to confirm what his heart and Alara's letter already screamed at him. The waiting period for the results was supposed to be 24 hours, an eternity. During that time, a strange, quiet rhythm established itself in the penthouse. Julian canceled all his meetings, an act that sent waves of panic through his company. He ignored the frantic calls from his board and his assistant. His focus had narrowed to the small girl who padded silently through his home. He tried to fill the silence with things. He had his assistant order a mountain of toys, books, and clothes, which arrived in a flurry of boxes. Serafina looked at the dolls with their perfect plastic smiles and the expensive art kits with polite disinterest. She gravitated instead to a small, smooth stone she'd had in her coat pocket, turning it over and over in her palm. That afternoon he found her standing before the grand piano in the main living area. He hadn't touched it since Annalise died. It was a perfectly tuned, silent memorial. "My mom played the piano," Serafina said, her voice soft. It was the most she had said to him at once. "She taught me a little song." Julian's throat tightened. Alara had loved to play. He remembered her filling his old apartment with music, a warmth he had foolishly mistaken for a commodity he could live without. Would you like to play it for me?" he asked, his voice strained. She shook her head. "It's not the same." Her piano was old and the keys were yellow. She touched one of the pristine ivory keys. "This one is too shiny." The simple observation was a gut punch. He was offering her a world of polished, shiny, empty things, when all she knew was a life of worn, yellowed, love-filled ones. The contrast was agonizing. His entire life, his success, felt like a cheap imitation of the richness she and Alara had shared. The call came the following afternoon. Julian was in his study, staring at a stock ticker that felt utterly meaningless. He answered on the first ring. "Mr. Vance," said the voice from the lab, formal and detached. "We have the results. The probability of paternity is 99%. Congratulations, sir. You have a daughter." Congratulations. The word was absurd. Julian hung up the phone without replying. He leaned forward, resting his head in his hands. It was done. The last pillar of his old reality had crumbled, and he was standing in the rubble. He was a father to a grieving 7-year-old girl who saw him as a stranger in a shiny, cold house. The full weight of his new reality pressed down on him, not with joy, but with the terrifying gravity of his own failure. He had spent 7 years building an empire, and in doing so had missed building the only thing that now mattered. His world hadn't just fractured, it had been demolished, and on the ruins stood a little girl who deserved a father far better than the man he had become. With the DNA results confirming the impossible truth, Julian knew he could no longer operate on instinct and observation. He had to act. He had to try, however clumsily, to bridge the chasm between them. He walked out of his study and found Serafina by the vast floor-to-ceiling windows looking down at the city below. She had her small hands pressed against the glass, her breath fogging a small patch. "Sarah," he began, testing the name out loud. It felt both foreign and sacred. She turned, her expression as solemn as ever. I know this is all very new and strange, for both of us, but I want you to know that you are safe here. This is your home now." The word home sounded hollow, even to his own ears. This sterile expanse was a residence, a showpiece. It wasn't a home. Ilara's letter had described a home filled with love, not marble. Serafina didn't respond. She simply turned back to the window. Julian felt a familiar surge of frustration, the kind he felt when a deal was stalling, but he quickly suppressed it. This wasn't a negotiation. This was a child. He knelt down, an unfamiliar and awkward motion in his tailored trousers, bringing himself closer to her level. "Your mother, Ilara," he said, his voice thick with unshed grief. "She was a wonderful person, very vibrant. She loved to laugh." A flicker of interest in her eyes. "She laughed all the time," Serafina whispered, her gaze still fixed on the city, "especially when we danced in the kitchen." An image flashed in Julian's mind. Ilara, years ago, trying to pull him into a dance in his old kitchen, her face alight with joy. He had rebuffed her, too, wrapped up in a dark mood to accept the gift of her light. The memory was a fresh wound. "She told me in her letter that you love dolphins," he tried, changing the subject. This time she turned fully to face him. "They're the smartest animals in the ocean. They talk to each other with clicks and whistles, and they play games, just for fun." A tiny spark of the child she was, buried beneath the grief, ignited in her eyes. "I see," Julian said, seizing the opening. Perhaps we could go to the aquarium this weekend. They have a new dolphin exhibit." She considered this, her head tilted. It was the first time he had seen her look like a child contemplating a treat, not a survivor assessing a threat. "Okay," she said quietly. It was a small victory, but it felt more significant than any stock market conquest. Over the next few days, Julian continued his clumsy attempts to connect. He learned to navigate the labyrinthine menus of streaming services to find cartoons about underwater life. He sat on the floor with her, attempting to build a complex castle out of a designer block set, his large hands fumbling with the small pieces while she assembled a simple, sturdy wall with practiced ease. He listened as she told him about her school, her best friend Maya, and the stray cat she and Ilara used to feed in their alleyway. Each detail was a window into the world he had missed, a world that was simple, textured, and rich in ways his could never be. He learned she liked her sandwiches with the crusts cut off, that she slept with a threadbare stuffed bunny named Patches, and that she was fiercely protective of the few things she had brought with her, a small framed photo of her and Ilara, and the smooth stone from her pocket. He tried to give her space, but the penthouse, for all its size, felt small with the force of her quiet grief. One evening he was working late in his study, reviewing a prospectus for a hostile takeover, when he heard a small sound from the hallway. He opened the door to find Serafina standing there, clutching Patches, her eyes wide with fear. "What is it?" he asked, his heart lurching. "The thunder," she whispered. Outside, the storm that had been threatening all evening finally broke. A low rumble shook the windows. Ilara's letter echoed in his mind. She hates thunderstorms. "It's okay," he said, his first instinct to be rational, to explain the science of it. But he stopped himself. He looked at her terrified face and saw not a problem to be solved, but a child who needed comfort. He set his papers aside. "Come on." He led her not to her own room, but to the media room, with its oversized, comfortable sofa. He dimmed the lights and turned on the massive screen, pulling up a documentary about dolphin pods he had bookmarked. He sat on the sofa, and after a moment's hesitation, she climbed up beside him, tucking her small body into the corner. As the thunder crashed outside, Julian began to speak, his voice low and steady, telling her not about the stock market, but about the images on the screen, about the way mother dolphins protect their calves, how they guide them through the vast, dangerous ocean. He didn't know if he was doing it right, but he kept talking, his voice a shield against the storm. After a while he felt a small weight against his arm. He looked down and saw that Serafina had fallen asleep, her head resting on his bicep, her breathing deep and even. Patches, the bunny, was wedged between them. The storm still raged outside, but inside the room there was a profound stillness. Julian sat there for over an hour, afraid to move, afraid to break the spell. His arm grew numb, but he didn't care. He looked at the daughter sleeping against him, this miracle of a girl who had survived his absence, and felt a fierce, primal wave of protectiveness wash over him. It was more than responsibility. It was a deep, aching love. In that moment, surrounded by the quiet hum of his expensive technology, Julian Vance finally felt the first stirrings of what it meant to be a father. The hostile takeover could wait. His world had already been conquered by a 7-year-old girl and her stuffed rabbit. The tentative peace in Julian's penthouse was a fragile ecosystem, easily disturbed. And the disturbance arrived in the form of a phone call from Victoria Davenport. Victoria was a force of nature in the corporate world, a woman as sharp and polished as the diamonds she wore. She was a senior partner at a rival firm, and for a brief, ill-advised period before he met Alara, she and Julian had been engaged. Their relationship had been more of a merger than a romance, a strategic alliance of two powerful ambitions. When he broke it off, she had been furious, her pride wounded more than her heart. For years, she had remained a professional thorn in his side, but recently, hearing of his continued success and solitary life, she had begun making overtures, suggesting they let bygones be bygones. "Julian, darling," her voice purred through the phone, smooth and confident. "You've gone completely off the grid. The entire financial district is in a panic. Don't tell me you've finally decided to retire to a private island without me?" "I've been occupied, Victoria," Julian said, his tone clipped. He was in the kitchen, watching Serafina carefully draw a picture of a yellow sun at the large marble island he designated as her art station. "So I've heard," she said, and he could hear the sly curiosity in her voice. "The rumor mill is working overtime." "Something about you canceling the final negotiations on the Ariane merger and holing up in your ivory tower. Some people are saying a child has been seen coming and going from your building." She laughed, a sound like ice cubes clinking in a glass. "Don't tell me one of your philanthropic endeavors has gone terribly literal." Julian's jaw tightened. "My personal life is not a topic for discussion." "Oh, but it is, Julian, when it affects a $10 billion deal that we both have a stake in," she retorted, her tone shifting from playful to sharp. "Whatever little project you're working on, I suggest you wrap it up. We have a meeting with the full board on Friday. Your presence is not optional." He ended the call without another word, a sense of dread coiling in his stomach. Victoria was like a shark. Once she smelled blood in the water, she would not stop circling. He knew her well enough to know that a mystery was a challenge she couldn't resist. His fears were realized 2 days later. He had taken Serafina to a private park he owned on the outskirts of the city, a lush green sanctuary he'd bought years ago as a land investment and had barely visited. For the first time, he saw Serafina truly smile. She ran through the grass, chasing a butterfly, her laughter echoing in the quiet air. It was a sound more valuable than any asset in his portfolio. He was pushing her on a swing, feeling a simple, uncomplicated joy when he saw a flash of light from the trees at the edge of the property. He froze. It looked like the glint of a camera lens, a long lens camera. He quickly lifted Serafina off the swing. "Come on, sweetie, it's time to go." "But why?" she asked, her face falling. "I like it here." "I know. We'll come back. I promise," he said, his mind racing. Who could have followed them? How did they even know about this place? The answer arrived on his phone that evening, a text from an unlisted number containing a single, grainy photo of him and Serafina in the park. The message below it was simple. "An interesting new acquisition, Julian. The market will be very curious about its origins. V. Victoria." She hadn't just been curious, she had hired someone to follow him. The cold fury that rose in him was immense. This was no longer about business. She had crossed a line, invading his life, and, more importantly, his daughter's privacy. He discovered the full extent of her digging a day later. She had somehow gotten a source within his PI's network, a man Harris had subcontracted for the hospital inquiry. Victoria didn't just know about Serafina. She knew about Alara. She knew the entire story, the secret pregnancy, the modest life, the sudden death. She possessed the one story that could utterly humiliate him and paint Serafina as the tragic, inconvenient product of a billionaire's forgotten affair. In Victoria's hands, their story wasn't one of loss and reunion. It was a scandal, a weakness she could leverage for her own gain. The fragile world he was trying to build for his daughter was now under direct threat from the most ruthless person he knew. The attack came faster and more brutally than Julian could have imagined. On Friday morning, the day of the crucial Aryan merger meeting, the story broke. It was the lead article on a notorious online gossip tabloid, a site known for its vicious takedowns of public figures. The headline was sensational and cruel. Vance's secret heir? Billionaire's love child surfaces after mother's pauper's death. The article was a masterpiece of insinuation and thinly veiled contempt, clearly fed by a source who knew the intimate details. It painted Alara as a desperate woman who had trapped a billionaire, and Julian as a cold-hearted tycoon who had ignored his own child for 7 years until her mother's death forced her upon him. It included the grainy photo of him and Serafina in the park, a moment of pure joy twisted into something sordid. The story spread like wildfire through the financial news networks, not as gossip, but as a question of Julian's character and stability. His phone began to ring incessantly, a chorus of panicked calls from his board members, his lawyers, his PR team. He stood in his study, ignoring them all, staring at the screen. The words blurred, but the venom was clear. They had made his daughter's grief into a public spectacle. He felt a rage so pure and cold, it was almost serene. He knew, without a shadow of a doubt, that this was Victoria's work. She hadn't just leveraged the information, she had weaponized it to create maximum chaos at the most critical moment. He heard a small noise and turned. Serafina stood in the doorway, her eyes wide. She must have woken up and come looking for him. She couldn't read the words on the screen, but she could read the tension in the room, the grim set of his face. She could feel the storm that had just broken over their lives. "Is everything okay?" she asked, her voice small. At that moment his private line buzzed. It was Victoria. He answered, his voice dangerously calm. "You've gone too far, Victoria." "Nonsense, Julian," she said, her voice triumphant. "I've simply cleared the board. The narrative is out of control, and you need someone to fix it. The board is about to vote. They're ready to kill the Aryan deal. They see you as unstable, reckless." But I've spoken to them. I have a solution. I'm listening, he said, his eyes never leaving Serafina, who was now clutching Patches, the bunny, to her chest. It's simple, Victoria explained, laying out her trap. We issue a joint statement. We announce our engagement is back on. It reframes the entire story. You're not a callous bachelor. You're a man settling down, creating a stable home. As for the child, we send her to a prestigious boarding school in Switzerland, the finest in the world. We frame it as giving her the best possible opportunities away from the prying eyes of the media. It shows you're being responsible. The board gets their stability, the deal goes through. We merge our empires, and this inconvenience is neatly handled. It's the only way to save everything you've built, Julian. Your legacy is on the line. There it was, the choice. The world he had spent his entire adult life creating, the power, the wealth, the legacy, or the small, grieving girl standing in his doorway. He looked at the frantic messages flashing on his screen, the blinking lights of the stock ticker predicting ruin. He saw the years of relentless work, the sacrifices, the sleepless nights, all culminating in the single moment. He could have it all, the empire he thought he always wanted. All he had to do was trade his daughter for it. He looked at Serafina. He saw her bravery, her quiet resilience, her mother's eyes filled with a sad wisdom. He saw the threadbare bunny she clung to for comfort. He thought of Alara's letter, her one simple request. Just love her. The choice wasn't a choice at all. Julian's gaze remained fixed on Serafina, who stood frozen in the doorway, a silent witness to a conversation she couldn't possibly understand. He saw the flicker of fear in her eyes, the innate way a child senses when the world around them is tilting. In her he didn't see an inconvenience, as Victoria had called her. He saw his daughter. He saw Ilara's legacy. He saw his own redemption. The empire of glass and steel he had built suddenly felt like a cage, and Victoria was offering him a gilded key that would only lock the door behind him. No, Julian said into the phone, his voice quiet but absolute. The single word hung in the air, filled with a finality that was as solid as bedrock. Victoria was silent for a beat, processing. "What did you say?" she asked, her tone laced with disbelief. "Julian, don't be a fool. This is everything. The Aryan deal is your masterpiece." "You're wrong," he replied, his voice gaining strength. He looked at Serafina and felt a profound clarity, a sense of purpose he hadn't experienced in years. "My masterpiece is standing in my doorway right now, and she is not for sale. She is not a problem to be managed or a scandal to be spun. She is my daughter." He walked over to his desk, picked up his other phone, and patched in the chairman of his board, a man named Gerald, who was undoubtedly in the middle of a frantic emergency session. "Gerald," Julian said, his voice ringing with authority, "put me on speaker. I have a statement for the entire board." He heard the fumbling and the hushed whispers before Gerald confirmed he was on. "Victoria," Julian said, his voice now broadcasting to the architects of his financial world, "let me be perfectly clear. Our professional relationship is terminated. Any contracts between our firms are to be reviewed for immediate dissolution. You will never set foot in my building or speak to a member of my staff again. And if my daughter's name, or her mother's, ever appears in proximity to yours again, I will bring the full weight of my resources down on you and your firm. I will dismantle everything you've built, piece by piece. Is that understood?" The silence from Victoria's end was his answer. She was stunned, outplayed. She had pushed him to a choice, never imagining he would choose a life she couldn't comprehend. "And to the board," Julian continued, his gaze softening as he looked at Serafina, who had taken a hesitant step into the room. "The Aryan merger is off the table, effective immediately. I am withdrawing our offer." A collective gasp and a flurry of protests erupted from the speakerphone. Gerald's voice cut through the noise. Julian, for God's sake, think about what you're doing. This will cost us billions. The stock is already plummeting. Money is just paper, Gerald. I've spent the better part of a decade accumulating it, and all it has bought me is an empty penthouse. I am restructuring my priorities. My full attention for the foreseeable future will be on my daughter. I am taking a sabbatical, effective immediately. I will appoint an interim CEO, and I expect you all to support them. If anyone on this board has a problem with that, their resignation will be accepted by the end of the day. He didn't wait for a response. He ended the call, plunging the room into a sudden, profound silence. He had just voluntarily detonated his own empire. He had walked away from the deal of a lifetime, threatened his allies, and torched his connection to a woman who represented the pinnacle of his old world. And as he stood in the quiet aftermath, he felt nothing but a powerful, soaring sense of relief. He felt free. He hung up on Victoria's line as well and crossed the room to where Serafina stood, her eyes wide. He knelt before her, just as he had done days before, but this time it didn't feel awkward. It felt right. "I'm sorry you had to hear any of that," he said gently. "There are some bad people in my world. But I want you to know something. Nothing is more important to me than you are. Not my company, not my money, nothing." Serafina looked at him, her expression shifting from fear to a dawning understanding. She looked at the phones on his desk, then back at his face. For the first time, she initiated contact. She reached out her small hand and rested it on his cheek. It was a gesture of profound, unhesitating trust. "Is the storm over?" she whispered. Julian covered her hand with his own, feeling the warmth of her touch spread through him, chasing away the last of the shadows. "Yes, sweetie," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "The storm is over. It's over for good." He had chosen his family, and in doing so he had finally, truly, come home. 1 year later, the sunlight that streamed into the penthouse seemed different. It was warmer, less sterile. It glinted not off untouched chrome and marble, but off a brightly colored finger painting taped to the refrigerator door, a vibrant yellow sun smiling over a blue ocean filled with crudely drawn dolphins. The cavernous living room, once an echo chamber of silence, was now softened by a plush, comfortable sofa that had replaced the severe designer couch. A colorful rug lay on the floor, and a half-finished puzzle was spread out on the coffee table. The home was no longer a monument to a ghost. It was a living, breathing space filled with the quiet hum of family. Julian sat on the new sofa, not in a suit, but in a comfortable sweater. He was watching Serafina, now 8 years old, as she carefully explained the rules of a complex board game to Mrs. Gable, the housekeeper who now served more as a doting grandmother figure. Sarah's laughter, a sound that had been so rare a year ago, was now the penthouse's most common currency. It was a sound that made Julian feel richer than any market rally ever had. His sabbatical had stretched from weeks into months. He had, as promised, stepped back from the day-to-day operations of his company. He still owned it, but his involvement was strategic, remote. He attended board meetings via video conference from his study, but his days were structured around school pickups, trips to the museum, and piano lessons. They had bought a new piano, an upright, with a warm, rich tone. It wasn't shiny. The keys were already beginning to lose their pristine white sheen from the hours Serafina spent practicing the songs Ilara had first taught her. Victoria Davenport had vanished from his world. After their final explosive conversation, she had attempted some corporate retaliation, but Julian, using his still considerable influence, had deftly neutralized her efforts. Her reputation took a hit from the failed power play, and she eventually left the city, a footnote in a chapter of his life he had firmly closed. The tabloid scandal had died down, replaced by a new narrative that Julian himself had crafted, one of a devoted father recalibrating his life. He had protected his daughter not by hiding her, but by celebrating her. He looked over at the mantelpiece where a single, elegant silver frame held a photo of Alara, smiling, her eyes bright. Next to it was a newer photo, one of him and Serafina at the beach, both of them grinning, their hair messy from the wind. He had made peace with the past, not by burying it, but by honoring it. He often told Serafina stories about her mother, sharing memories of Alara's wit and her kindness, ensuring that she grew up knowing the woman who had given her life and loved her so fiercely. Serafina looked up from her game and caught him watching. She smiled, a bright, gap-toothed grin that mirrored his own. "Dad, it's your turn to roll the dice," she called out, her voice filled with happy impatience. Dad. The word still hit him with a jolt of quiet wonder every time he heard it. He stood up and crossed the room, the title settling over him as comfortably as his favorite sweater. He was no longer Julian Vance, the ruthless magnate, the isolated king. He was a father. He was home. He knelt by the game board, picking up the dice, his world no longer measured by stock prices and corporate conquests, but by the simple, immeasurable joy in his daughter's eyes. The silence he had once craved had been replaced by laughter, by music, by life. And he knew with a certainty that resonated deep in his soul that he had never made a better deal.